Hi everyone. In this session, I'm going to talk about optional class in Java. Optional has been introduced in Java 8. It is used to represent a value that may or may not be present, especially on the method call. The method may return a value or may not return a value that you would expect, so that the caller method can handle that situation. So that is the idea of optional, and it helps us to avoid null checks. When we try to access an object, there is a possibility that that may have a null reference. Let's see how optional can be used and how can we write a better code with optional classes. Okay. In this example, I'm going to um give a demonstration with the employee class. The employee class will have a department class as a property. The department will contain only a domain, the employee which belongs to, right? Okay, so here I'm just make a call to the get employee department method. I'm passing the ID. Here I'm creating a new employee object. First I need to pass a ID in the constructor of employee, then the name of the employee Bob, and I need to create a new department. Since it's an object, I'm creating an object, department object with domain name in the constructor. Uh, CS, right. Assume this employee record is present in the database. When calling this method with the ID, this method looks into the database and fetch the employee record. Assume like that. What are the possibilities when we look into the database? What are the possible outcomes we can get? There may be a connectivity exception. There may be the database lookup may not have the employee record for that particular ID which we pass. And the expected outcome would be the employee record. By passing the ID we can get the employee record, right? These are the possibilities. Consider the happy flow. We pass the employee ID 123 and we get the employee object. Assume like that. Once we get the employee object, how can we get the employee domain? Employee dot get department dot get domain. It's very simple, right? I'm returning the employee domain. So what's the problem here? Here we may get null. The employee object may be null if the employee record is not found in the database. We would eventually end up with null here. By trying to access a property from the null reference, you would end up with null pointer exception. Correct? Let's check that. Yeah, we are getting null pointer exception. How to avoid this? We will generally go with the condition if statement. If employee null not equal to employee, then try to access a department inside in it, or else return default, right? So we'll get a default value. There is a possibility the department may null, right? This could be a null. There is a possibility for that. Again, you will end up with null pointer exception when try to access a get domain from the null reference, right? In order to avoid this, what we generally do, again, we do one more null check. Yeah, here we find that employee dot get department is null, and then since this method is not, this if statement is not executed, and it returns default value. To have a proper code structure, we can add these braces. This is fine. So with optional, how can we avoid this sequence of null checks? How can we handle this with optional? Let's try that. We need to wrap the employee object in the optional. Optional, consider optional is like a box. Inside that box, I'm putting an employee object. I may put employee object, I may not put. If I put employee object, the optional box contains employee data, otherwise it is empty. There is no null if employee may present or may absent, right? Optional dot of nullable. There are two methods you use to put objects inside optional. One is optional dot of, another one is optional of nullable. If you are not sure, the expected output will have value or may null. If you're not sure on that, you just go with of nullable. That means you are expecting a null object here, right? So error, just comment out this. Yeah, this is fine, right? I'm creating a department object, passing the value in the constructor while creating the object. Domain again CS, right? So how can I now it returns, it creates a employee object and it is optional of employee. How can I get the value from the optional? Employee dot get, right? Get dot department dot get domain. Let's see. Okay, I just forgot to comment out. Yeah, it returns the domain name. This is fine. What if this employee dot get is null? In optional classes, there is no concept called null. Here we can say the employee object is present or absent. What if employee object is absent in the optional? Let's see that. Let me comment out this. You can pass the null inside the optional dot of nullable, because here you make a database call that would eventually returns null value, null reference. So this means optional dot of nullable of null means optional dot empty. This is equal to optional dot empty. Both are same. So I'll just use optional dot. Okay, I'll just keep it as optional dot nullable because this mimics the realistic scenario where you look into the database and it is not finding the record and it returns the null object, null reference here. So here you will have a employee instead of employee optional, you will be having a empty optional, right? Let's see what is happening now. What is the response we get? No such element exception. That means no value present, right? To avoid that, what we can do, we can have condition employee dot is present. There is a rule, we should not use get method until we are sure that value is present. Okay, Now it returns the default value because employee optional is empty. It is not present, so this method is not executed and returns the default value. Okay, now we have a question. What is the difference here? Previously we were using null check. Now we are using optional dot is present. Just we replace null with is present condition, correct? What is the benefit we get out of it? It is very similar like null check. With this combination, we can get the data out of the optional object, but this is not a recommended way. Try to avoid this kind of code. Instead, there are different ways to extract the values from the optional class without doing these checks. Right? We'll see it in a minute. So now we know optional class is empty employee dot. That is a map function inside optional. Map that transform one type to another type. So here we have optional of employee that will be converted into another type. I'm passing that and get that department value and then passing, I mean doing another map. Here I am basically the map returns optional of another type, right? Optional of department. I'm passing the optional of employee and I'm getting optional of department. Map returns optional of object. So now I'm passing optional of department element inside in it object and I'm getting the domain. So this basically returns a optional of string. Yeah, this would works fine. And then from EMP optional, with this reference you can get the value. Another way to do this, instead of assigning the variable, assigning the value into the variable, you can just call the get. This returns a string. Here you are getting no such element exception. Yeah, you are trying to get a value that is not present, so you are getting this no such element exception. So previously we had a condition and return a default value, right? Here also you can do such thing, or else. There is a method called or else. Here you can send the default value. So if any of the chains doesn't have a value, it will go to the condition which we specified here, like or else we are returning the default, right? If we want to throw an exception, then you can just go with or else throw. It takes a supplier. You can pass the exception supplier and then throw an exception. So let's check how it behaves when it has a value, right? It returns a value CS. So consider here it is null. It returns a default. So we can avoid a sequence of null checks and we can write a better code with optional instead of doing all those null checks or whether the value is present the optional or not. This and all we can avoid, and we can write a neat code with optional and avoiding these null checks and all. Uh, yeah, that's it for this tutorial. Leave out your comments, and we'll see you in the next tutorial. Thanks.